Sergeant Tommy Thorne was a hurricane in a uniform. He didn't patrol the streets of this city, he conquered them. For 2 decades, he had been the most decorated, most feared, and most controversial officer in the precinct. The mayor called him a symbol of urban renewal. His colleagues, behind closed doors, called him a liability. The public, who only saw the headlines of drug busts and gang leaders in handcuffs, called him a hero. But those who had the misfortune of encountering him in the shadows knew the truth. Thorne was an engine of chaos, a man unburdened by rules, and a law unto himself. He was a hulking man, with a bull neck that strained the collar of his uniform, and a face that seemed permanently etched in a scowl. His voice was a low growl, and his eyes, cold and calculating, had a way of stripping a person of their dignity before he ever laid a hand on them. He had a reputation for getting results, and in a city plagued by violent crime, results were all that mattered to the brass. Internal affairs complaints followed him like a shadow, a paper trail of accusations, excessive force, witness intimidation, destruction of property, but every single one was dismissed, marked unfounded or insufficient evidence. Thorne had a network of allies, a web of political favors and unspoken loyalties that protected him. He was a creature of the system, and the system, it seemed, was designed to protect its most brutal instruments. For every arrest he made, a story was left untold. The teenager who slipped and broke his arm during a routine stop. The landlord who had his property mysteriously condemned after refusing to cooperate with an investigation. The elderly woman whose prized garden was accidentally trampled during a search. Thorne left a trail of ruined lives and broken bodies, all in the name of a distorted sense of justice. The city's official narrative was that he was a necessary evil. The silent truth was that he was just evil. But even the most powerful storms eventually meet a wall, and that wall came in the form of Detective Lena Hayes. At 35, Lena was a paradox in the precinct. She was a by-the-book detective, a meticulous investigator who believed in the slow, painstaking work of building a case brick by brick. She had a quiet intensity, a sharp mind, and a sense of moral clarity that her colleagues had long since lost. She had been on the force for a decade, and in that time, she had watched Thorne's reign with a mix of revulsion and quiet fury. She had seen the way his methods poisoned the well, making it impossible for honest cops to build trust in the community. The day everything changed started with a simple call, a car break-in. A woman's purse had been stolen. It was a low-priority case, but it led Lena and her partner to a derelict street where a group of teenagers was known to hang out. As they arrived, they saw another squad car and the unmistakable sight of Thorne. He had a young mannequin really slammed against a wall, his face pale with terror. Lena and her partner, Detective Rodriguez, a man who had long since learned the art of looking the other way, watched in a silent horror as Thorne interrogated the boy. Thorne's voice was a low growl, barely audible, but his actions were clear. He twisted the boy's arm, his knuckles white, until the boy cried out in pain. Then, without warning, he threw the boy to the ground, slamming his head against the curb. The boy's body went limp. Rodriguez grabbed Lena's arm. "Don't," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Don't do it, Lena. We didn't see anything." But Lena had already reached for her phone. She started recording, the camera pointed down, capturing only the soles of their shoes and the audio. She heard the sound of the boy's head hitting the ground, the sickening thud. She heard Thorne's guttural grunt of satisfaction. And then, she heard Thorne turn to face her and her partner. "Something wrong, detectives," Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescension. Lena slowly raised her head, meeting his gaze with a cold, unwavering stare. "Just making sure the paperwork's handled properly, Sergeant. That's a good kid you got there. We'll be needing a statement for our case." Thorne's eyes narrowed, a flash of pure hatred. He knew what she was doing. He had seen it before. He released the boy and sauntered over to their car, a predatory swagger in his step. "You're a new one," he said, his voice a low, chilling purr. "Just remember, Hayes, there's a right way to do things, and a wrong way. The wrong way gets you a target on your back." He walked away, leaving the boy on the ground, a trickle of blood from a gash on his forehead. Lena knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. She knew that the war had just begun. She didn't file a complaint. She knew it would be buried, just like all the others. Instead, she went to a retired investigator, a man named Leo Vance, who had spent 30 years in internal affairs, a lifetime of fighting the machine and losing. He was a quiet man with a shock of white hair and a weary look in his eyes. He listened to her story, his face impassive. When she finished, he took a sip of his lukewarm coffee and looked at her. "What are you gonna do?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I'm going to get him on a lifetime of crime, not just one. I'm going to find every complaint, every victim, every witness. And I'm going to build a case that can't be dismissed." Vance smiled, a sad, weary expression. "They'll chew you up and spit you out, kid. He's got friends everywhere." "I know," Lena said. "That's why I need your help. You've seen it all. You know where the bodies are buried." Vance's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long, long time. The naive, fiery belief in justice he had lost years ago. He knew it was a losing battle, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. He agreed to help, but only from the shadows. He would guide her, but she would have to do the legwork. He knew that for this to work, it had to be her fight. Lena's crusade began in the quiet corners of the city archives. She spent her nights sifting through old, dusty files, searching for Thorne's name. She found dozens of complaints, all marked unfounded. She began to cross-reference them with police reports, news articles, and court documents. The pattern was a brutal mosaic. The same story, told over and over again, in different versions. The same excessive force, the same lack of probable cause, the same witness intimidation. Thorne had been a one-man wrecking crew for decades. She tracked down the victims one by one, a painstaking and often heartbreaking process. An artist who had lost the use of his dominant hand after Thorne accidentally broke his wrist during an arrest. A small business owner who had his shop mysteriously fail a health inspection after refusing to pay Thorne for protection. A young man who had been a witness to a Thorne assault and had been accidentally run off the road, resulting in a permanent injury. The fear was palpable. Many of them had moved on, trying to forget their encounters with Thorne. Many refused to talk, terrified that he would find them and finish the job. But then, she found a glimmer of hope. A retired officer, a man named Sergeant Al Harris, who had worked with Thorne for over a decade, agreed to meet her. He was a small, nervous man who spoke in hushed tones, as if he was afraid Thorne was listening. He told her about the culture of fear Thorne had cultivated, a grim code of silence that kept everyone in line. He described how Thorne would plant evidence and fabricate probable cause. He told her about the dozens of cases where Thorne's excessive force had been covered up by his superiors, who were more concerned with closing cases than with justice. His testimony was a torrent of information, and it gave Lena the first real breakthrough in her investigation. The pressure was immense. Thorne knew she was digging. He had eyes and ears everywhere. He started following her, showing up at her favorite coffee shop, standing outside her apartment building, his presence a silent threat. He never said a word, but the message was clear. I know what you're doing, and I will destroy you. Her superiors, sensing the tension, pulled her aside. Her captain, a man who had long protected Thorne, warned her, Hayes, this is a career ender. You're playing with a lion. He will not stop until you are broken. Walk away now. It's not worth it. But Lena couldn't walk away. The weight of all those buried complaints, of all those victims who had been silenced, felt like an obligation. She knew that if she failed, Thorne would be more powerful than ever. He would have proven once and for all that he was truly untouchable. She had to succeed. She had to do it for all those people who had been wronged. The final piece of the puzzle came from a man named Marcos Diaz. Thorne had arrested him years ago for a minor drug charge and had brutally beaten him. Marcos had filed a complaint that was, of course, dismissed. He had lost everything, a job, a girlfriend, and his faith in the system. When Lena found him, he was a broken man, a shell of who he used to be. He had seen the news story of Thorne and was ready to talk. He told her that Thorne had been obsessed with a case years ago and had been sure that Marcos was involved in it. He had a witness who had disappeared. Marcos told Lena that the witness, a woman named Anna, had been threatened by Thorne. She had moved to a different city and changed her name. Lena tracked Anna down, and after a week of trying, she finally got her to agree to an interview. Anna was a terrified woman with a child she was trying to protect. She agreed to give a statement, but only if it was to the district attorney directly, and only after the charges against Thorne had been filed. She needed to know that her testimony would be the final, crushing blow. Lena promised her that her safety was her #1 priority. With Anna's name as her final ace in the hole, Lena went back to Vance. He read through her meticulously organized binders. The chronological timeline of Thorne's abuses, the witness statements, the medical reports she had acquired from friendly doctors, the interviews she had recorded with Thorne's victims. His face was a mask of grim satisfaction. He looked up at her, a glimmer of respect in his tired eyes. You did it, kid, he said, his voice raspy. You found the cracks in the armor. The next morning, Vance walked into the district attorney's office, his arms full of binders and files. The DA, a young, ambitious woman named Elena Rodriguez, listened to him and Lena for hours. She was skeptical at first, but as she read the evidence, her skepticism turned into a grim determination. The case wasn't just a simple assault. It was a RICO case, a pattern of racketeering and corruption, an abuse of power that stretched back decades. This wasn't just a police officer being charged with a crime. This was an entire system being put on trial. The next morning, the news hit the precinct like a bombshell. A grand jury had been impaneled. A sealed indictment had been handed down. Sergeant Thorne was to be charged with 27 counts of criminal misconduct, including assault, battery, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. The charges were not for a single incident, but for the entire pattern of his behavior. The justice served in court from the news headline was a punch to the gut for anyone who had ever been a victim of the lion. Thorne was in his office, his feet propped up on his desk, when Vance and Lena walked in with 2 uniformed officers. The uniforms were an insult, a clear message that this wasn't a departmental matter. This was a criminal one. Thorne looked at Lena, and a slow, cold smile spread across his face. "You," he said, his voice a low growl. "The little gazelle with the big ideas. You're making a mistake, kid. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I think I do, Sergeant," Lena said, her voice shaking slightly, but she held her ground. She looked at Vance and nodded. Vance read Thorne his rights, his voice a steady monotone. Thorne just laughed, a short, barking sound. He didn't resist. He was too smart for that. He just stared at Lena as they cuffed him, his eyes filled with a predatory glare. He was confident. He had beaten the system before, and he believed he would beat it again. He knew the dirty secrets of his colleagues, the political favors he was owed, and the loopholes in the law. He believed he was still the untouchable lion. The following months were a circus. The trial of the people versus Thomas Thorne became the biggest story in the city. The media dissected every detail of his career, from his early days as a beat cop to his rise as a decorated, ruthless leader. The victims, emboldened by Lena's work and the very public nature of the trial, began to come out of the woodwork. Marcos Diaz, the man who had lost a tooth, testified. Sergeant Al Harris took the stand and recounted his years of working with Thorne. And then, at the very end, Anna, the witness who had fled the city, came back to testify, her voice trembling but clear. She told the court how Thorne had threatened her and her family to keep her silent, how he had destroyed her life to protect himself. Thorne's defense team tried to paint him as a victim, a dedicated officer who had been betrayed by a naive, politically motivated rookie. They called his commendations into question and attacked the character of the victims. Thorne himself took the stand, his demeanor one of cool, collected arrogance. He denied everything, calmly refuting every accusation with practiced ease. He seemed to have an answer for everything, a plausible explanation for every bruise and every complaint. He was a master manipulator, and for a moment, Lena felt a sickening sense of doubt creep into her heart. Had she really found him out? Or was he just a man who had done the dirty work no one else had been willing to do? Then, the DA pulled out the final piece of evidence. It was an audio recording, a snippet of a phone call Thorne had made to his captain years ago. It had been buried in the department's archives, an overlooked file that Lena had found while sifting through thousands of records. In the clip, Thorne could be heard, in a moment of frustration, talking about how he had made an example of a suspect who wouldn't talk. A veiled confession that confirmed the testimony of Marcos Diaz. It was the crack in his armor, the moment of vulnerability that exposed his true nature. The smug smirk on his face evaporated, replaced by a cold, silent rage. He had been so confident that he had forgotten the one thing that could truly bring him down, his own arrogance. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and the entire city held its breath. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was so silent you could hear a pin drop. "Guilty," the foreman said, his voice ringing with finality. On all counts. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a chorus of murmurs. Thorne's face went slack, a mask of disbelief and shock. For the first time in his career, he had lost control of the narrative. He was no longer a legend, a lion, or an institution. He was just a man, a criminal, a felon. The judge sentenced Thorne to 15 years in prison, the maximum sentence for his crimes. As he was led away in shackles, he looked at Lena one last time. There was no rage in his eyes, only a cold, chilling sense of defeat. He had finally been brought to justice. The precinct was a different place after Thorne's conviction. The air was lighter. The silence had been replaced with nervous chatter. Some of the old guard, Thorne's allies, resigned or transferred to other precincts. Vance, for his part, retired, his faith in justice finally restored. Lena, meanwhile, was hailed as a hero by her colleagues, a beacon of hope for a system that was long overdue for a change, but she knew it wasn't that simple. Thorne was just one man, a symptom of a larger systemic problem. The culture of silence, the political protection, the ingrained arrogance, it was all still there, lingering in the halls like a bad smell. She had won a battle, but the war was far from over. She knew that the fight for justice was not about a single man, but about the constant struggle against the erosion of ideals. She sat at her desk, looking at the news headline on her phone. Out of control cop brought down justice served in court. The words resonated with a deep and poignant truth. For all the years of pain and suffering, for all the victims who had been silenced, for all the officers who had looked the other way, justice had finally arrived. And as she looked around the precinct, at the faces of the young officers who had come after her, she knew that she had to keep fighting. She had to make sure that another Thorne never rose to power again. She had to ensure that the finally was not a destination, but a promise for the future. I hope this story is what you were looking for. I focused on making it longer by expanding on the characters, the investigation, and the trial itself. If you'd like to explore a different angle or a specific part of the story, just let me know.